If you've arrived here at the end of a long day, or in the quiet hours before the world wakes up, or simply because some part of you was searching for something soft and unhurried, then you are exactly where you're meant to be. Hello and welcome to Quiet Knowledge. There is no rush here, there is nothing to keep up with. All that's asked of you in this moment is to settle in. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your breath slow. Perhaps close your eyes for just a moment, and then, when you're ready, come with us. Because the natural world, this ancient, patient, extraordinarily beautiful world, has been doing remarkable things long before any of us arrived, and it will go on doing them long after. And among all those remarkable things, perhaps the most wonderful of all is how deeply it asks us to be still. So let's be still together. Let's go somewhere quiet and discover what's been waiting there all along, somewhere beneath your feet, right now, regardless of where you are standing or sitting. There exists a world so densely connected, so quietly purposeful, that it makes the entire internet seem like a rough sketch of an idea. Beneath forests, beneath meadows, beneath the soil of gardens and parks and ancient woodlands, a vast and living web is at work. It is made not of cables or circuits, but of fungal threads so fine they are invisible to the naked eye. Each one a fraction of the width of a human hair, and yet each one a conduit for something the scientists who study them can only describe, with increasing wonder, as communication. These threads are called hyphae, and they belong to mycorrhizal fungi, a name derived from the Greek words for fungus and root, which is fitting, because this is precisely where the relationship begins, at the root. When the fine, hair-like roots of a tree extend downward into the soil, they do not merely seek water and minerals in isolation. They make contact with the fungal network already living. There, and in doing so, they join something far larger than themselves. The exchange that follows is one of the oldest mutualisms on Earth, and it has been going on for approximately 450 million years. Long before flowers existed, long before bees had evolved to pollinate them, long before the forests we know today had taken their current shape. In this exchange, the tree provides the fungus with sugars, the carbon-rich products of photosynthesis, that extraordinary process by which sunlight is converted into food. In return, the fungus provides the tree with minerals and water from deep within the soil, minerals that the tree's own roots cannot reach alone, drawn up through the hyphal threads and delivered directly to the root tips. But the most quietly astonishing aspect of this network is not the exchange of nutrients. It is what happens when one tree needs help. Scientists studying old-growth forests, particularly the ancient Douglas fir forests of the Pacific Northwest, have found that the largest, oldest trees, sometimes called mother trees by the researchers who study them most closely, are deeply connected to hundreds of younger trees through the fungal network. When one of those younger trees is in shade, struggling to photosynthesize because the canopy above is too dense for sunlight to reach it, something remarkable happens. The older trees send carbon through the network directly to the roots of the smaller one. Not incidentally, not accidentally. In measurable, directed quantities that vary depending on the degree of need. And when a tree is dying, when it has been injured by a storm or disease and its own days are drawing to a close, it has been observed to release large quantities of carbon into the surrounding network, a kind of final, generous act, a passing on of resources to the forest around it. Whether this constitutes anything like awareness, anything like intention, is a question scientists are careful to hold lightly with appropriate humility. The biology does not require consciousness to function, but the pattern the directed, responsive, relational nature of the exchange, asks something of us in the presence of a forest. It asks us to consider that the stillness we feel when we walk among old trees may not be entirely in our own minds. There may be something genuinely communal happening beneath our feet. To stand in a forest, then, is to stand at the surface of a conversation that has been ongoing for hundreds of millions of years. The trees around you, those great, slow, silent beings, are not alone. They are listening in their way, and they are speaking. And that, quietly, is one of the most beautiful things about the world. There is a reason that people across centuries and cultures have gone to forests to think, to grieve, to recover, to find themselves again after being lost. For most of human history, this was understood as something spiritual, something beyond the reach of explanation, and perhaps it is, in ways that science has not yet found language for. But science has, in the last few decades, begun to describe some of what actually happens to the human body in the presence of trees. And what it has found is both fascinating and deeply comforting. It begins with something you cannot smell, not exactly, or rather something you smell without knowing you're smelling it. Trees breathe. Not in the way we breathe, but they exchange gases with the atmosphere in a continuous rhythm-driven process. And as part of that process, they release volatile organic compounds, complex molecules that disperse into the air around them. Among the most studied of these compounds are a class called phytoncides, natural antimicrobial substances produced primarily by conifers, though present in many tree species. The word comes from the Greek phyton, meaning plant, and the Latin caedere, meaning to kill. They were first studied for their ability to protect trees from bacteria, fungi, and insects. But in the 1980s, Japanese researchers began to investigate something curious: the measurable health benefits experienced by people who spent time in forests. The practice they were studying had a name, Shinrin-yoku, which translates roughly as forest bathing, and the effects they measured were striking. Time spent walking slowly through forested environments with no goal, no destination, no fitness objective, produced significant decreases in cortisol, the hormone most closely associated with stress. It reduced blood pressure, it lowered heart rate, it improved mood in ways that outlasted the walk itself, sometimes for days. Later research identified phytoncides as a key mechanism. When humans inhale these compounds, which they do simply by breathing the air in a forest, a cascade of responses begins in the body. Natural killer cells, a category of immune cell particularly important in the body's defenses against viruses and tumors, become more active and more numerous. Levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline, the hormones that keep the nervous system in a state of alertness and vigilance, decrease. The parasympathetic nervous system, often described as the rest and digest system, the counterpart to the fight or flight response, becomes more dominant. In other words, the forest, quite literally and chemically, tells the human body that it is safe. There is something deeply moving about this, if you sit with it for a moment. The trees are not trying to calm us. They are not producing these compounds for our benefit. They produce them as part of their own immune systems, their own processes of protection and maintenance. But we evolved alongside trees, in forests for most of our species' existence, and somewhere in the long conversation between our biology and theirs, something became attuned. The chemistry that helps trees resist infection also happens to help us remember how to rest. The implications are still being explored. Studies continue to emerge from Japan, South Korea, and Europe, demonstrating the measurable health impacts of forest environments on human physiology. Some hospitals in these countries have begun to incorporate forest views, forest walks, and even the indoor use of wood materials and plant-derived aromas as part of therapeutic environments. But you don't need a study to feel it. If you have ever walked into a forest and felt within a few minutes a slow unclenching, a loosening of something you had been holding without realizing it, then you have felt the chemistry working. You have felt the trees speaking a language your nervous system already knows how to hear. The forest does not ask you to do anything. It does not require anything of you. You only need to be present, and it begins, quietly and without ceremony, to take care of you. There is perhaps no sound in the natural world more universally associated with rest than rain. People seek it out. They play recordings of it to help themselves sleep, to focus, to decompress after long and difficult days. Parents have, since the beginning of recorded human history, held restless infants near windows where rain falls against glass. Poets have reached for it again and again as a metaphor for the particular peace that arrives after a kind of surrender. Something in the sound of rain touches something very deep in the human nervous system, and the story of why this is so is as layered as the sound itself. To begin with the physics, rain is not a single note. It is a chord, a complex, constantly shifting spectrum of frequencies produced by the simultaneous impact of thousands of individual droplets against thousands of different surfaces. A raindrop falling on still water produces one sound. On a leaf, another. On soil, another still. On pavement, on stone, on glass, on the surface of a pond. Each surface returns a different acoustic signature, and in even the gentlest of rainfalls, hundreds of these signatures are present at once, overlapping, blending, shifting as the rain intensifies or softens. This produces what acousticians call broadband noise. Sound spread across a wide range of frequencies simultaneously. And broadband noise, particularly in the lower frequencies, has a well-documented effect on the human brain. It activates what researchers call the default mode network, or DMN. The default mode network is the system of brain regions that becomes most active not during focused, goal-directed activity, but during rest, daydreaming, memory consolidation, and what might loosely be called mind wandering. It is associated with creativity, with emotional processing, with the kind of soft, associative thinking that happens when we are not trying to do anything in particular. When we listen to rain, the steady, non-threatening, non-alarming nature of the sound, its consistency, its lack of sharp transitions, its absence of anything that resembles a predator or a warning, allows the brain's threat detection systems to stand down. The amygdala, that ancient neural structure responsible for the fear response, finds nothing in rain to respond to. And in that absence, the deeper, quieter systems take over. The brain does not merely tolerate broadband noise, it uses it. The gentle acoustic masking provided by rain helps to smooth out the sharper, more disruptive sounds that would otherwise interrupt the drift toward rest. A distant voice, a door closing, the sudden sharp intrusion of a notification. Rain becomes a kind of sonic shelter, a soft wall that holds the outside world at a small and comfortable distance. There is also something that happens in the body as well as the mind. The smell of rain, that rich, complex, intensely evocative scent that rises from the earth when the first drops land on dry soil, has a name: petrichor. The word was coined in 1964 by two Australian scientists, Isabel Joy Baer and Richard Thomas, who identified it as a combination of compounds: plant-derived oils that accumulate in dry soil during periods without rain, and geosmin, a molecule produced by soil bacteria called actinomycetes. When rain falls, these compounds are released into the air in tiny aerosol droplets, and we inhale them. Geosmin is one of the most potently detectable molecules known. The human nose can perceive it at concentrations as low as 5 parts per trillion. A sensitivity that scientists believe may have deep evolutionary roots. The ability to detect the smell of rain from a distance would have been extraordinarily valuable to our ancestors. A signal of water, of the end of drought, of renewed abundance. The pleasure we take in that smell, the almost involuntary sense of ease it produces, may be an echo of that ancient usefulness, wired into us by a very long history of responding to rain as good news. And so, when the rain comes, something in us recognizes it. Not quite consciously, not in a way we can fully articulate, but in the way the body recognizes warmth, or the smell of food, or the presence of someone safe. It is a recognition that reaches below language, below thought, into the oldest, quietest layer of what we are. Let the rain fall. There is nothing here that needs your attention, just the soft percussion of water finding its way home, and the earth below, waiting to receive it. On certain nights along certain coastlines, the ocean glows. It is not a bright light, not the kind that casts shadows or illuminates faces. It is something softer and stranger than that. A cold, blue-green radiance that pulses in the waves, that lingers in the wake of a boat, that traces the outline of a swimmer's body in luminous fire. It appears where the water is disturbed, as if the sea itself is responding to being touched, answering every movement with light. This phenomenon is bioluminescence, and it is produced by living organisms, most commonly in coastal surface waters, by vast populations of single-celled creatures called dinoflagellates. These are among the most abundant organisms in the ocean, and most of the time they are entirely invisible. Too small to be seen individually, present in numbers too large to comprehend. But when certain conditions are met, warm water temperatures, high nutrient levels, the right concentration of particular species, they bloom in numbers that can reach millions of individuals per litre of water. And when those concentrations are disturbed, something extraordinary happens. Within each dinoflagellate cell, there is a light-producing chemical reaction. It involves a molecule called luciferin and an enzyme called luciferase, names that carry the Latin root for light. And when the cell is agitated by movement, by the pressure wave of a breaking wave or the passage of a hand through water, the reaction is triggered and a photon of light is released. A single dinoflagellate produces so little light it is undetectable to the human eye. But millions of them, triggered simultaneously by the movement of a wave, produce something the human eye catches and remembers for the rest of its life. The purpose, from the organism's perspective, is thought to be defensive. When a dinoflagellate is disturbed, its flash of light may attract a larger predator to whatever is disturbing it. A zooplankton, perhaps, that will be consumed by the fish drawn to the light, leaving the dinoflagellate itself alone. It is a kind of alarm call, a biological signal that says, something is here, attend to it. The fact that it produces, in human beings standing on a dark beach, a sensation of profound wonder is an accident of scale and perception. Some of the world's most famous bioluminescent bays exist where geography and ecology conspire to keep the glowing organisms concentrated in relatively enclosed waters. The bioluminescent bays of Puerto Rico, Mosquito Bay on the island of Vieques in particular, have been recognized as among the brightest on Earth, their glow sustained by nutrient-rich mangrove runoff and the relative calm of the enclosed water that prevents the organisms from dispersing. In certain seasons, the water there glows with such intensity that every movement of a paddle or a hand creates trails of cool fire, and a swimmer in the dark leaves a human-shaped aurora in their wake. But bioluminescence is far from limited to these famous places. Open ocean waters at depth exist in a world almost entirely lit by living things. Below the reach of sunlight, roughly 200 meters down, the ocean is dark in the way that nothing on land is ever quite dark. A darkness so complete and so absolute that it functions as a separate element. And in that darkness, life has found light. Anglerfish dangle luminous lures above their mouths to attract prey. Siphonophores, colonial organisms of extraordinary length and complexity, drift through the deep, their bodies streaked with patterns of cold light. Certain species of squid have light-producing organs distributed across their bodies in arrangements so precise and so beautiful that they have been compared, by the scientists who photograph them, to stained glass. It is estimated that perhaps 76% of all marine life in the open ocean produces some form of bioluminescence. This means that the deep ocean, that enormous, largely unexplored realm that constitutes the largest living space on Earth, is, in the dark, a place of light, a place of signals, of conversations, of living fire passing through water. There is something about this that is almost too large to hold in the mind, that in the deepest darkness of the deepest sea, the water is full of light, that life in its persistence and its ingenuity and its endless variation found a way to carry its own glow through the void. Let that sit with you for a moment in whatever quiet space you occupy right now. In the deepest dark, there is always something making light. Every year, in the cold and nutrient-rich feeding waters of the polar seas, humpback whales eat. For months, they feed almost continuously, gulping vast mouthfuls of krill and small fish, storing the energy of the sea in thick reserves of blubber. They eat with a kind of quiet urgency because they know, in whatever way a whale knows things, that the time for eating will not last. And then, when some inner signal that science has not yet fully decoded tells them the time has come, they stop eating and they turn toward warmer waters, and they go. The migration of humpback whales is one of the longest journeys made by any animal on Earth. From their Antarctic feeding grounds, some populations travel northward to the tropical waters around Tonga or the Silverbank near the Dominican Republic, a distance of up to 8,000 kilometers, one-way undertaken. The same individuals return to the same feeding grounds and the same breeding areas year after year with an accuracy that rivals the best GPS systems humans have devised. How they navigate is not fully understood, and the mystery of it is part of its beauty. The evidence suggests that whales use multiple overlapping systems, each one a different form of reading the world. The Earth's magnetic field, invisible to human perception, but a constant, complex presence detectable at different intensities in different locations, appears to function as a kind of map. Whales have been found to have magnetite crystals in their bodies, the same iron-containing mineral found in animals known to navigate by magnetic sensing. Birds, fish, sea turtles. The magnetic geography of the ocean floor, the variations in field strength that different locations produce, may be read by a whale the way a traveler reads road signs. Sound is another map. The ocean is not a silent place. It hums with a constant acoustic environment, and certain features of that environment are geographically stable. The patterns of underwater sound produced by wave activity, by current, by the specific acoustic properties of different sea floors, may provide navigational information to animals that have had hundreds of thousands of years to learn to read it. Whales, whose hearing is among the most sensitive and sophisticated of any mammal, have been found to make sounds that travel extraordinary distances through the ocean. Hundreds, in some cases thousands of kilometers. And the acoustic landscape they navigate through is rich with information. And then there are the songs. Male humpback whales sing. The songs they produce are among the most complex vocalizations in the animal kingdom. Structured, patterned sequences of sounds that can last for hours, repeated with precise fidelity, audible to other whales across enormous distances. The songs are not fixed. They change, gradually and continuously, across a breeding season and across years, as new phrases are introduced and spread through populations. A song heard in one part of the ocean may, within a few years, be recognizable in populations thousands of kilometers away, passed from whale to whale like a melody carried from town to town. What the songs mean is not fully known. The leading hypothesis is that they are primarily a form of sexual selection, a signal of fitness broadcast by males in breeding waters. But the songs are also heard during migration, during situations where no obvious reproductive context is present, and some researchers have suggested that they may serve purposes we have not yet imagined. Communication over distances that no other animal but humans has managed to bridge with deliberate vocalization. Perhaps something, Singer is cold and vast and mostly empty. Singer is cold and vast and mostly empty of light. The song moves outward through the water at speeds far greater than sound in air, reaching, if the conditions are right, into distances that dwarf anything a human voice could cross. And somewhere, perhaps, another whale hears it, turns slightly, adjusts course. The world is older and more intricate than we usually have time to consider. The whale navigates by the planet's own magnetic field, that invisible force produced by the molten iron at the Earth's core, 3,000 kilometers below the floor of the ocean. The whale sings into a darkness lit only by the bioluminescence of disturbed plankton in its wake. The whale has been making this journey for longer than our species has existed. To travel that far, in that dark, following that ancient signal, there is something in that image that asks very little of us except wonder. The mountains feel permanent. This is perhaps their most immediate gift to us. The sense, standing at their feet or moving along their flanks, that we are in the presence of something that was here before us and will be here after. The granite face, the limestone ridge, the long sweep of an alpine meadow beneath permanent snow. These things feel fixed, settled, outside of time in a way that most of the world around us is not. And yet the mountains are moving. This is not a metaphor. The Himalayas, the highest mountain range on Earth, the range that contains Everest, Kangchenjunga, Lhotse, and dozens of other peaks that rise above any other point on the planet, are growing at a rate of approximately 5 millimeters per year. This is not very fast. 5 millimeters is roughly the width of a fingernail. But the process that produces it is so ancient, so immense in its scale, so strange in its mechanics, that to think about it carefully is to feel the ground shift slightly beneath everything one thought, one understood about permanence. The Earth's outer layer is not solid in the way it appears. It is broken into a mosaic of enormous pieces, tectonic plates, that float astonishingly slowly on a layer of partially molten rock called the asthenosphere. The plates move at speeds comparable to the growth rate of human fingernails, a few centimeters per year in most cases. But over millions of years, a few centimeters per year becomes continents rearranged, oceans opened and closed, mountain ranges built and eroded and built again. The Himalayas are the result of a collision that began approximately 50 million years ago, when the tectonic plate carrying the Indian subcontinent, which had been an island continent, drifting northward through what is now the Indian Ocean, made contact with the Eurasian plate. The collision has not stopped. The Indian plate continues to press northward at roughly 5 centimeters per year, driving beneath the Eurasian plate in a process called subduction, and the compressive force of that ongoing collision pushes the Himalayan range upward at the same time that erosion, wind, water, ice works to wear it down. The reason Everest is the height it is today is that the balance between uplift and erosion, over millions of years and under specific conditions of climate and geology, produced a mountain that has not yet been worn to nothing. Other ranges older than the Himalayas, the Appalachians of eastern North America, for example, or the Scottish Highlands, were once as tall or taller and have been worn over hundreds of millions of years to their current, gentler forms. The Himalayas are geologically young, which is part of why they are still so tall, still so sharp, still growing by that quiet, unhurried 5 millimeters each year. 5 millimeters in a year. The accumulation of an invisible pressure that has been building for 50 million years. Mountains growing the way a person might grow over a lifetime. Slowly, continuously, in increments too small to observe directly, but real and cumulative, and, in the end, enormous. There is a meditation here if you want it. The things that seem most permanent are, on a long enough timescale, in motion. The things that seem most stable are, in their deep structure, quietly changing. The mountain that has stood for 10 million years will stand for 10 million more, and by then, it will be different. Eroded here, uplifted there, crossed by glaciers that have retreated and returned, altered by the slow negotiation between stone and weather that never reaches a final settlement. All of this happening right now, beneath the surface of things. The mountains are breathing in a timescale that makes our own lifetimes look like the briefest of exhales. And still, they feel permanent. And still, in their slow, ancient way, they are. Watch a wave long. Enough, and something begins to dissolve. The busy, categorizing, problem-solving part of the mind that spends most of its waking hours identifying and processing and responding. Watch the waves long enough, and eventually that part steps back a little, and something quieter takes its place. People have known this for a long time. The ocean has been a place of rest and restoration in almost every human culture that has had access to it. But the physics of what a wave actually is, and what it actually does on its way from the open ocean to the shore, contains within it a kind of poetry that is only deepened by understanding. Here is what a wave is. It is not water moving. It is energy moving through water. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive and most beautiful fact about ocean waves. When you watch a wave rolling toward a shore, it looks as though the water itself is traveling, as though some great volume of sea is being pushed from one place to another. But this is an illusion produced by the way the energy passes through the medium. The water molecules in an ocean wave do not travel forward with the wave. They move in circles, each molecule rising as the crest passes overhead, moving forward at the crest, sinking as the trough arrives, moving backward at the bottom, and then rising again as the next crest approaches. The net displacement of each water molecule after a complete wave cycle is very close to zero. They return almost to where they started. What travels is the pattern, the shape, the energy. This is why a seagull floating on the ocean does not travel towards shore with the waves passing beneath it. It bobs up and down, rising and falling with each crest and trough, but stays essentially in place. The energy of the wave passes through the water the way a vibration passes through a stretched string. The string does not move from one end to the other. but the pattern of its vibration does. Ocean waves are born far from any coast, most often by wind blowing across open water. When wind meets the surface of the sea, friction transfers energy from air to water, and the surface begins to wrinkle into small ripples. If the wind persists and the ocean is vast enough, and the Pacific Ocean is vast enough in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate, those ripples grow into wavelets, wavelets into swells, and swells travel outward from the storm that created them like the rings from a stone dropped in a pond, but on a planetary scale. A wave generated by a storm in the North Pacific may travel thousands of miles, passing beneath the surface of the ocean in orderly procession before it finally arrives at a coastline, perhaps in California, perhaps in Hawaii, where the physics of shallow water force it to do what we recognize: rise up, lean forward, break. In shallow water, the bottom of the wave, the circular motion of the water molecules in the trough, begins to drag against the sea floor, compresses until the crest outruns the compresses, until the crest outruns the trough and topples over in the breaking we know so well. That long, white, breathing collapse of water onto shore. The sound of that collapse, that particular deep, rhythmic percussion, is, in many ways, the signature sound of the planet. The frequency of it, approximately 0.1 Hz in typical ocean swells, is slow enough that it falls below the range of human hearing in its pure form, but in the range that the body feels rather than hears. And the breaking of a wave near a shore produces sounds and vibrations across a wide enough range to reach us in both modes at once, through the ear and through the skin and through the bones. Researchers studying the physiological effects of ocean environments have found that the presence of waves, the sound of them, the rhythmic predictability of them, produces patterns in the brain that bear a striking resemblance to those seen in meditation. The brain, in the presence of that rhythm, tends toward alpha wave states. The pattern of neural oscillation associated with relaxed alertness, with the quiet wakefulness that sits between active thinking and sleep. The brain is not falling asleep, but neither is it engaged in the kind of effortful cognition that dominates most of waking life. It is, in the presence of the waves, something in between, resting and open and gently, pleasurably present. This too has evolutionary roots. Our ancestors spent a great deal of time near water, near rivers, near lakes, near coasts. The sounds associated with water and its movements would, for most of human history, have been sounds associated with safety, a reliable source of something necessary for life, in a place where predators were typically not lurking. The brain learned to relax in those sounds, the same way it learned to relax in forests in the dark, when rain was falling. The calm that the ocean produces in us is not separate from us. It is an echo of a very long conversation between our species and the world that shaped us. Every wave that arrives on a shore has traveled in some form from somewhere else. The energy in it was wind once, and before that, the temperature differential between warm and cold air masses, and before that, the uneven heating of the atmosphere by the sun. The wave carries in its movement and in its sound the history of a journey you will never fully trace. It arrives and breaks and is absorbed into the shore, and then the next one comes. In the shallow, rocky shallows of every temperate and tropical ocean on Earth, there is an animal going about its business with such improbable intelligence, such evident curiosity, such flexible and inventive engagement with its environment, that the scientists who study it tend to use words they usually reserve for mammals with large brains and long evolutionary histories. The octopus has a brain, several of them in a sense. The central brain is relatively modest in size, but 2/3 of an octopus's neurons are located not in the central brain, but distributed throughout its 8 arms, each of which contains hundreds of suckers. Each sucker rich with sensory cells, capable of both touch and taste simultaneously. Each arm can, to a considerable degree, act independently. If an octopus's arm is separated from its body, as sometimes happens in encounters with predators, the arm will continue to respond to stimuli for an hour or more, reaching toward food, avoiding painful contact, behaving in many ways as if it still had a purpose. This raises questions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness that philosophers and neuroscientists have only begun to seriously grapple with in recent decades. The octopus has what appears to be, by any functional definition, a mind distributed across its body, a form of cognition that is genuinely alien to anything in our own experience of what it means to think and perceive. And the evidence of that cognition is remarkable. Octopuses have been documented using tools, carrying coconut shell halves across the sea floor to use as portable shelters, which requires planning, because the shells are unwieldy to carry and offer no immediate benefit, only the deferred reward of having a hiding place when needed. They learn with extraordinary speed. An octopus shown a jar with a food item inside will solve the puzzle of opening it in a very small number of trials, and will then open subsequent jars with increasing efficiency, suggesting that they form and apply mental representations of problems in ways that look, from the outside, like deliberate reasoning. They play. Individual octopuses in laboratory settings have been observed repeatedly releasing objects into currents created by water filters and catching them as they return. Behavior with no obvious survival function, repeated too many times, and in too consistent a pattern to be attributed to anything except what it appears to be. They have preferred activities, preferred investigators, observable responses to novel stimuli that vary between individuals in ways consistent with individual personality. They are curious. This is not an anthropomorphism imposed on a behavior. It is the most accurate description of what careful observation reveals. Their camouflage is, in its way, a kind of thought made visible. An octopus can change the color, pattern, and texture of its entire body in less than a second, matching the background it sits against with a precision that is not merely reactive but anticipatory. When an octopus moves from one substrate to another, the transition in appearance begins before full contact is made, suggesting that the animal is reading its environment and computing its response in advance of the moment when the response is needed. This is not simple, reflexive mimicry. It involves perception, comparison, and decision-making processes of considerable sophistication. And yet, the octopus does all of this with a lifespan of 1 to 3 years, with no parental care or social learning, entirely alone from the moment it hatches until the moment it dies. Almost everything an octopus does and knows it figures out independently. There is no culture, no tradition, no accumulated wisdom passed from generation to generation. Every octopus is, in a very real sense, discovering the world from scratch. What this suggests about the nature of intelligence, about how and where and in what forms complex cognition can arise, is both humbling and wonderful. We tend as a species to think of intelligence as something that evolved slowly across long lineages in social species with large brains. The octopus is a reminder that this is only one way for minds to emerge, that the universe seems in certain conditions to tend toward intelligence, and that the shapes that intelligence can take are more varied and more strange than we had previously imagined. There is an octopus somewhere in the shallow water off some rocky coast, right now, pulling at a crab, reading the world through its skin, watching you from eyes that evolved independently of yours but arrived across 500 million years of separate history at a design almost exactly like your own. The octopus and the human did not inherit similar eyes from a common ancestor. They arrived at similar eyes by different paths because eyes, it turns out, are a good solution to the problem of perceiving light, and the universe is generous in offering good solutions when the right pressures are applied. We share the world with something genuinely alien, and it is watching us back. From a distance, from an airplane window looking down through clear, shallow, tropical water, a coral reef looks like something painted. The colors are too vivid, the patterns too intricate, the sheer density of form too elaborate to look quite real. Blues and greens and yellows and oranges, punctuated by shadow, layered with movement, shifting as the sunlight filters through water that is always, gently, in motion. This is the most biodiverse ecosystem on Earth. In terms of the number of species occupying a given area, the coral reef has no parallel in any habitat anywhere. Not the rainforest, not the deep sea, not the richest grassland or the most ancient wetland. A reef covering a few square kilometers may harbor 10,000 species of marine life, from the largest sharks to creatures so small they live between the grains of sand at the reef's base. It is, in the truest sense, a city, a place where enormous numbers of different kinds of life have found ways to coexist by filling every available niche, every available role, every available source of food and shelter. And like a city, the reef was built. Not by design and not quickly, and not by a single builder, but by the accumulated labor of countless generations of tiny animals, each one adding an almost imperceptible increment to a structure that has been growing, in some cases, for thousands of years. The builders are coral polyps, small, soft-bodied animals closely related to sea anemones and jellyfish that secrete around themselves cups of calcium carbonate, the mineral that makes limestone. Each individual polyp is tiny, a few millimeters across, living within its calcium cup and extending its tentacles at night to capture the microscopic organisms that drift by in the current. During the day, the polyp relies instead on a different food source: photosynthetic algae called zooxanthellae, which live within the polyp's tissues in one of the most intimate and ancient partnerships in biology. The zooxanthellae use sunlight to produce sugars through photosynthesis and share those sugars with their coral hosts. In return, the corals provide the algae with shelter, with carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, and with nitrogen from their waste products. This exchange, this mutualism, is the engine of the reef. It is why coral reefs exist only in warm, shallow, sunlit water. They are limited by the light requirements of their internal partners. And it is why coral bleaching, the phenomenon produced when water temperatures rise high enough to stress the polyps into expelling their zooxanthellae, is so devastating. Stripped of their photosynthetic partners, the corals lose their color and their primary food source, and if the stress is prolonged, they die. But when conditions are right, when the water is warm but not too warm, clear but not too clear, nutrient poor in exactly the way that tropical seas tend to be, the reef grows, slowly, patiently, at rates of perhaps 1 to 2 centimeters per year for the branching species, and a few millimeters per year for the massive domed forms. The Great Barrier Reef, the largest reef system on Earth stretching for more than 2,000 kilometers along the northeastern coast of Australia, has been growing in its current form for approximately 20,000 years, since the sea levels of the last ice age began to rise and flooded the continental shelf with the warm, shallow water that corals require. 20,000 years. A coral colony can live for centuries. the individual polyp at the outer surface of an ancient coral head is an animal no different, in any meaningful biological sense, from the polyp whose skeleton it rests on, buried meters below in the rock. A polyp that died 1,000 years ago. The reef is, in a sense, a single continuous entity, the living surface of a mountain of its own dead. An accumulation of generations of builders who created, by the simple act of living and secreting, calcium carbonate and dying and leaving their cups behind, a structure large enough to be seen from space. Every fish that shelters in the branching coral, every octopus that hides in the crevices, every cleaner wrasse that maintains its tiny station where larger fish come to have parasites removed, every sea turtle that navigates to a particular reef year after year. All of them are inhabitants of a city that was never planned, never designed, never overseen, and yet has achieved a complexity and an elegance and a productivity that no human architecture has yet approached. The reef asks nothing of its inhabitants except that they participate in the exchange, that they play their role in the cycling of energy and nutrients that keeps the whole intricate structure alive. Everything takes something and everything gives something in an equilibrium so finely balanced that it can persist for millennia, and yet so finely balanced that even small disruptions can unravel it. But when it is whole, it is extraordinary. A city of light and color and motion, built by creatures with no brains to speak of, maintained by the of light, is completing a journey of approximately 150 million kilometers. It began 8 minutes and 20 seconds ago, in the nuclear furnace at the heart of the sun, a place where temperatures exceed 15 million degrees Celsius, where hydrogen nuclei are fused together with such force that they form helium, and where the energy released in that fusion eventually, after a journey that takes roughly 100,000 years to rise from the core to the solar surface, leaves the sun as a photon of light. 100,000 years inside the sun, bouncing, absorbing, re-emitting, making its way through the dense plasma of the solar interior at a pace so slow that, compared to the speed of light itself, it is almost comical, and then, at last, released from the surface. Free, moving at the full speed of light, approximately 299,792 kilometers per second. And across that enormous 150 million kilometer gap, which light covers in 8 minutes and 20 seconds, it travels through nothing. Not air, not water, not glass. Through the near-perfect vacuum of interplanetary space. And then it reaches Earth. Some of it is reflected. Some is absorbed by the atmosphere. Some reaches the surface of the ocean and drives the photosynthesis of phytoplankton. Some falls on a leaf and begins its transformation into sugar inside a chloroplast. Some falls on the surface of a pond, disturbing the film that the pond skater stands on. Some falls on your face, right now, as you sit somewhere on this planet, and is absorbed by your skin, where it begins to trigger the synthesis of vitamin D, a process that connects you, physically, chemically, to that nuclear fire 150 million kilometers away. There is something both humbling and grounding about this. Every ray of sunlight that has ever warmed you has traveled, in a form, for 100,000 years inside the sun before it could begin its 8-minute journey to reach you. The warmth of a spring afternoon contains, in a very real sense, a journey that began before most of human civilization. The light that makes it possible for you to read these words has been in transit, in one form or another, for a stretch of time that dwarfs anything we have personal experience of. And there is more. The nuclear reaction at the heart of the sun that produced this light, The fusion of hydrogen into helium was seeded by hydrogen atoms that formed in the first few minutes after the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago. The hydrogen that the sun is burning today, the hydrogen whose fusion produces the light that reaches your skin in the space of an afternoon, is primordial hydrogen, matter that has existed in some form for nearly as long as the universe itself has existed. You are warmed every day by the oldest stuff in the universe, doing what it has been doing since the first stars formed, releasing the energy that has always been latent within it, making its way across the solar system to land, very gently, on you. The sun will continue to do this for approximately another 5 billion years. Long after every structure humans have ever built has dissolved, long after the planet's current geography has been rearranged beyond recognition by tectonics and erosion, long after the last animal that shares any genetic heritage with us has lived and died, the sun will still be fusing hydrogen into helium and releasing light that travels in 8 minutes and 20 seconds across 150 million kilometers of empty space. 8 minutes. In the morning, when light reaches through a window to touch the floor, it has come from somewhere almost too far to imagine, and it arrives as warmth. It arrives as simply and as gently as a hand placed on a shoulder. In the shaded corners of the world, on the north-facing sides of old stones, in the hollows of tree, roots along the edges of slow streams, in the quiet of old-growth forests where the light arrives already filtered through 100 layers of canopy, moss lives its unhurried life. It is one of the oldest lineages of land plants, having colonized the terrestrial world somewhere between 450 and 500 million years ago, long before trees, long before flowers, long before anything resembling a modern plant had worked out the engineering problems of growing tall. Mosses are small. In a world that celebrates the large, the towering tree, the migrating whale, the mountain range still pushing skyward, mosses make their case in miniature, in the space of centimeters, in the territory that other plants overlook. But in that overlooked territory, they accomplish things that have drawn the attention of acousticians, architects, and engineers. Moss absorbs sound, not in the way that thick walls absorb sound, not through mass and density, but through structure. The surface of a moss plant seen under magnification is extraordinarily complex. A dense, three-dimensional tangle of tiny leaves and stems, each one contributing to an architecture of irregular surfaces, narrow channels, and small cavities. When a sound wave enters this structure, it encounters an enormous surface area relative to the volume of material. The sound bounces and ricochets through the irregular spaces, and at each bounce, a fraction of the sound's energy is converted to heat through friction. A minuscule amount, but one that accumulates as the sound travels deeper into the moss. This is why forests are quiet, even in the absence of obvious sound-absorbing surfaces. The soft floor of an old-growth forest, thick with moss, with decomposing leaves, with fungi and soft organic material, behaves acoustically like natural soundproofing. Sound that would bounce and echo in a hard-surfaced environment is instead absorbed, dampened, returned to the forest as a warmth so faint as to be undetectable, and the result is a particular quality of quiet that anyone who has spent time in old forests will recognize. Not silence, but stillness. A depth of quiet in which even the sounds that remain, birdsong, wind, water, seem to take on a different quality, as if each one occupies more space, as if they are somehow more present because the background noise against which they would usually compete has been softened away. Moss also holds water with extraordinary efficiency. A single gram of dry sphagnum moss, the genus most commonly found in wetlands and bogs, can absorb and hold up to 20 times its own weight in water, releasing it slowly as the surrounding environment dries. This water-holding capacity has shaped entire landscapes. The vast peat bogs of the northern latitudes, stretching across Canada, Russia, Scotland, and Scandinavia, are the accumulated product of thousands of years of sphagnum growth, layer upon layer of partially decomposed moss, holding the water of an entire climate system, storing carbon in quantities that make them one of the most significant terrestrial carbon sinks on Earth. And yet the individual moss plant is doing none of this at scale. It is simply being what it is, clinging to its stone or its bark or its soil, with structures that evolve to hold water and absorb light in conditions where larger plants cannot compete. It is working in the margins, in the small spaces, doing what moss has always done. There is a Japanese aesthetic concept called wabi-sabi, a beauty found in impermanence, in incompleteness, in the unpretentious, quiet things that age and weather have shaped. Moss is, in many ways, the emblem of wabi-sabi. An old stone covered in soft green moss, damp with morning moisture, the light catching the small, irregular surfaces of the leaves. There is in that image a particular kind of peace that has nothing to do with scale or spectacle. It is the peace of something that has settled in slowly, over time, asking nothing and giving something back that is hard to name but easy to feel. The world is quieter in the places where moss grows. The world is softer, and softness, in the end, is its own form of strength. The planet breathes, not as we breathe, not with lungs, not in seconds, not in and out in a rhythm we could hear or count, but in a pattern that repeats, year after year, on a cycle that anyone who has paid close attention to the natural world has felt, even if they have not always had the language for it. Every spring in the Northern Hemisphere, something remarkable happens to the atmosphere above Earth. As the days lengthen and temperatures rise, plants begin to photosynthesize in earnest, billions of them, from the Arctic tree line to the subtropical forests, from the temperate grasslands to the alpine meadows. And as they photosynthesize, they do something to the air. They pull carbon dioxide out of it and store it as sugar in their tissues. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, measurable with great precision by instruments at stations around the world, drops. Every year, from roughly April through September, the CO2 concentration falls as the Northern Hemisphere's vegetation breathes in. Then, as autumn arrives and leaves begin to fall and decompose, as the growing season ends and the dormant season begins, the vegetation releases much of that carbon back into the atmosphere. The CO2 concentration rises again, reaching its peak in the Northern Hemisphere's late winter. The cycle repeats. This signal, this annual oscillation in atmospheric carbon dioxide, first measured with great care by the American scientist Charles David Keeling, beginning in 1958 at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, is visible on the famous Keeling curve graph as a regular, wave-like pattern overlaid on the longer-term rise in CO2 that human activities have produced. Scientists call it the seasonal cycle of the carbon budget. More evocatively, it might be called the breathing of the land. What makes this image so striking is the scale of it. The rise and fall in atmospheric CO2, produced by the Northern Hemisphere's growing season, represents the collective respiratory activity of nearly all the land plants on Earth. Every forest, every meadow, every field, every garden, every roadside weed and rooftop succulent and moss-covered stone. All of them together acting as a single lung. And the seasonal cycle does not just alter the atmosphere, it shapes everything. Migration patterns follow it. Birds move with the seasonal pulse of food availability, which is itself a pulse of plant productivity, which is the planet's exhale of oxygen and green. The movements of insects track it. Ocean productivity cycles with it, as seasonal changes in wind patterns drive the upwelling of deep, nutrient-rich water that feeds the phytoplankton blooms of spring. Even the tilt and wobble of the planet itself, the Milankovitch cycles that describe Earth's orbital variations over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, drive deeper versions of the same seasonal principle, producing ice ages and interglacials that are, in a sense, very slow breaths of a much longer rhythm. We live inside a breathing planet. The seasons are not just something that happens to us. They are something we are part of, something we inhale and exhale with. Every spring when we eat the plants that are eating the air, every autumn when those plants drop their leaves and return their borrowed carbon to the cycle. The bread on the table was, a few months ago, carbon dioxide in the air, pulled down by a wheat plant drinking sunlight in a field somewhere. The oxygen in each breath was, a few weeks ago, a water molecule split by photosynthesis in a leaf that may already have fallen. We are part of the breath. We are not separate from it. This planet's long, slow respiration moves through us as surely as the wind moves through a forest. And we are, in ways that science is still learning to fully articulate, an expression of that breathing rather than a visitor to it. There is something deeply calming in this, if you let it settle. We belong here not as observers but as participants. The seasons do not happen outside us. They happen through us, with us, as part of the same continuous and ancient exchange. Breathe in, breathe out. The planet is doing it with you. There is a number that appears in the strangest places. It is not a large or particularly dramatic number. It is simply 1.618, give or take a few decimal places. A ratio most commonly known as the golden ratio, or, in its more dynamic form, the Fibonacci sequence. And once you know to look for it, the natural world begins to seem less like a collection of random forms, and more like a series of variations on a single, deeply elegant theme. The Fibonacci sequence begins simply 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, and so on. Each number the sum of the two that precede it. It was described by the Italian mathematician Leonardo of Pisa, known as Fibonacci, in the 13th century, in a thought experiment about the population growth of rabbits. But the sequence had been known to Indian mathematicians centuries before, and it describes something that neither the rabbits nor the mathematicians invented. It describes the growth of living things. When a plant grows, it produces its leaves, petals, or seeds according to a simple rule. Each new element emerges at a fixed angle from the one before it. The most efficient angle, the angle that allows each new leaf to receive the maximum amount of sunlight without being shaded by the one before it, and each new seed to be packed most tightly without gaps, turns out to be approximately 137.5 degrees. This is the golden angle derived from the golden ratio. It is not a rule that plants follow consciously. It is an outcome of the way plant cells respond to the signaling molecules that direct growth, molecules that naturally produce this spacing because it corresponds to the most efficient local arrangement of limited resources. The result is that the spirals visible in a sunflower's center, in a pine cone's scales, in the arrangement of a pineapple's segments, in the petals of a rose as they unfurl, in the seeds of a raspberry. All of these follow Fibonacci numbers. Count the spirals in a sunflower head in one direction, and you'll find 34. Count in the other direction, and you'll find 55. Both are Fibonacci numbers. The scales of a pine cone spiral in 8 rows in one direction and 13 in the other. The florets of a Romanesco broccoli form fractals in which each smaller spiral is a miniature copy of the larger one, and the number of spirals at each scale follows the sequence. Shells form their spirals by growing at a constant ratio. Each new section of the shell is a fixed proportion larger than the previous section. This produces a logarithmic spiral, a shape that expands outward from its center while maintaining always the same angle between the spiral and any radius drawn from the center. The Nautilus shell, cross-sectioned, reveals a chamber-by-chamber construction in which each new chamber is precisely proportioned to the one before. The spiral expanding at the golden ratio. The shell grows outward without changing shape, only scale. A form of growth that is both beautiful and, in its elegance, a little moving. What does this mean? It means that the mathematical structures that appear in abstract number theory, patterns discovered by human minds working in abstraction, also appear in the growth of organisms, because growth under constraint tends toward efficiency, and efficiency tends toward certain mathematical forms. The universe is not arbitrary. It has preferences expressed not as choices but as the tendencies of physics and chemistry and biology working together under the pressures of natural selection and the conservation of energy toward forms that are both functional and, to human eyes, beautiful. We did not invent the golden ratio. We found it in the world in the place where mathematics and biology meet. And in finding it, we found that the beauty of a shell or a flower is not accidental, not merely aesthetic, but is an expression of something deeper. The tendency of living things to find, through the accumulated trials of evolution, the most elegant solution to the problem of growth. A shell on the shore spiraling inward toward its center is a record of millions of years of problem solving. A sunflower face packed with seeds in those precise interlocking spirals is a solution so good that evolution has arrived at versions of it independently in dozens of different plant lineages. The mathematics was always there, waiting to be found. In the growth of cells, in the unfurling of leaves, in the slow accretion of calcium carbonate around a growing animal at the bottom of the sea. Fibonacci, sitting in 13th century Pisa, working through his rabbit problem, did not know he was describing the architecture of flowers, but the flowers already knew. Look up on a clear night, away from the lights of any city, and the sky does something to time. It stretches it. It reminds you, in a way that is somehow both unsettling and profoundly peaceful, that the present moment is not the only moment. That the light reaching your eyes right now has not just traveled in space, but in time. That some of what you see when you look up is, in the most literal sense, the past. The star closest to our own sun. Proxima Centauri, a small red dwarf that would be invisible to the naked eye even if you were standing in its system, so faint is its light, is 4.24 light-years away. This means that the light from Proxima Centauri, traveling at nearly 300,000 kilometers per second, takes 4.24 years to reach us. What you see when you find the Alpha Centauri system in the southern sky is not where those stars are now. It is where they were 4.24 years ago. The stars of the Orion constellation are further still. Rigel, the bright blue-white star at Orion's foot, is approximately 860 light-years away. The light that makes Rigel visible to you tonight left that star in the year 1165. While the Crusades were reshaping the medieval world, while cathedral builders in Europe were still laying the foundations of structures that are now considered ancient, while the Anasazi people of North America were building the great cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde. That light has been traveling ever since, and it has arrived after all of that time at your eye. Betelgeuse, the bright reddish star at Orion's shoulder, is approximately 700 light-years away. It is also, on an astronomical timescale, extremely near the end of its life, a massive star that will eventually undergo a catastrophic collapse into a neutron star or black hole, an event that will produce a supernova visible in daylight from Earth. When this happens is unknown, but the remarkable thing is this. It may already have happened. The supernova might have occurred 500 years ago, or 200 years ago, or last week, and we would not know until the light from the explosion reached us. Betelgeuse might not exist anymore, and the star we see in Orion's shoulder tonight is a memory, a long, slow message from a star that has since gone silent. Further still, the Andromeda Galaxy, the nearest large galaxy to our own, a spiral of stars containing perhaps 1 trillion solar masses, is visible to the naked eye on a clear, dark night as a faint smudge of light near the constellation Perseus. The light from Andromeda left that galaxy 2.537 million years ago. When it began its journey toward us, our species had not yet fully emerged. Homo habilis, one of our distant ancestors, was beginning to shape stone tools on the African savanna. The animals whose fossils we now find in the rock, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, horses very different from modern horses, were alive. The light that your eye receives from Andromeda tonight departed that galaxy in a world unrecognizable as the world we know. And the universe, as best we can tell from observations with the best instruments we have yet built, stretches in every direction to a horizon approximately 46 billion light-years away. The light from objects at that distance has been traveling since the universe was young, since the first stars ignited in the cooling aftermath of the Big Bang, and began the process of forging the heavier elements that would eventually, across billions of years and several stellar generations, find their way into rocks, into oceans, into cells, into you. The iron in your blood was made in a star that exploded before the sun was born. The carbon in every cell of your body was forged in stellar interiors and distributed through the galaxy in supernova shockwaves over billions of years before gravity gathered it into a new solar system, into a new planet, into the chemistry of life. You are, in the most rigorous scientific sense, made of starlight that arrived long before you did. To look up at the night sky is to look at the history of the universe as it literally presents itself to your eyes, light by light, moment by arriving moment. It is to receive messages from unimaginable distances, from unimaginable depths of time, and to stand for a moment at the very edge of the present, where the ancient past is still arriving. There is nothing louder than this idea, and nothing quieter. The silence of a clear night sky is the silence of the deep past, speaking in the only language it has: light. For most of human evolutionary history, fire was the center of everything. It was warmth in the cold. It was protection from predators who learned quickly that the circle of firelight was not a circle they wished to enter. It was the means by which food was cooked, extending the range of what was edible and reducing the energy required to digest it. Some researchers, most notably the biological anthropologist Richard Wrangham, have argued that the control of fire and the practice of cooking were not just incidental advantages for early humans, but the very engine of our encephalization, the dramatic expansion of the human brain relative to body size that distinguishes us from our closest relatives. If cooking allowed our ancestors to extract more energy from food, and if more energy meant a brain could grow larger, then fire is, in this view, the reason you can read these words. We have been sitting around fires for at least 1,000,000 years, perhaps longer, and the traces of that immense formative experience are written into what our nervous systems do when we see one. A study published in 2014 by researchers at the University of Alabama found something that was, perhaps, not entirely surprising, but was remarkable in its specificity: that people who watched a fire tended to show significant decreases in blood pressure, and that this effect became more pronounced the longer they watched. The fire did not need to be large or dramatic or particularly warm. The effect was present even in controlled laboratory conditions where participants watched videos of fire. The sound of the fire, however, that soft, irregular crackle and pop, appeared to enhance the effect. The combination of the visual and the auditory, that particular pattern of flickering, variable light paired with soft, random sound, produced something in the human nervous system that looks, measurably, like relaxation. The researchers proposed an evolutionary explanation that the fire-induced relaxation response is an ancient adaptation, selected for because it was beneficial. For 1,000,000 years, sitting at a fire in the evening was the safest time in the day. The predators were kept away by the light. The work of daylight hours was done. The warmth allowed the body to ease its own temperature maintenance. There was nothing to do but be still, to socialize, to tell stories, to let the mind drift into the kind of associative, imaginative state that is supported by firelight and discouraged by the urgent attention demanded by daylight and work. And in that state, something happened. Stories were told. Knowledge was transmitted. Art in some of its earliest forms, the cave paintings, the chipped ochre, the careful arrangements of objects that have no obvious practical purpose, was made by people who were doing so by firelight. The human mind, as it evolved, was shaped in part by the particular quality of thinking that happens in the warm, low, flickering light of an evening fire. This is why firelight feels different from electric light. It is not merely a matter of color temperature, though that is part of it. Firelight is warmer in tone, containing more orange and red frequencies, and the human eye is adapted to respond to that palette as a signal of evening, of rest, of the end of the day. It is also the flicker. The brain tracks the irregular variations in firelight's intensity in a way that is distinct from its response to the steady, unwavering output of electric lamps. The randomness is important. It is the specific randomness of something alive, something that cannot be fully predicted from one moment to the next, and tracking that pattern gently engages parts of the brain associated with relaxed attention in a way that steady light does not. A fire in a fireplace, even a small candle flame, recalls something that is older than language in us. The crackle, the warmth, the shadow and the light moving together on the wall. These things speak to a part of the brain that was formed before cities, before agriculture, before everything we think of as civilization. A part that has, somewhere in its deep memory, 1,000,000 years of evenings, when this was all there was, and it was enough. More than enough. Somewhere in the permafrost of the Siberian Arctic, in soil that has been frozen for 10,000 years, there are seeds that are still alive. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a small miracle. It is a feat of biological engineering so extraordinary that when scientists first confirmed it, when they germinated seeds of the narrow-leafed campion plant, recovered from a 32,000-year-old squirrel's cache in the frozen banks of the Kolyma River in 2012. The result was reported in journals of the highest distinction. 32,000 years. That is before the last glacial maximum, before the extinction of the woolly mammoth and the Neanderthal, before the earliest cave paintings in Lascaux. The seeds germinated, They grew. They flowered, producing white blooms that had not bloomed on Earth since the Pleistocene. A seed contains, in its quiescent state, everything necessary for a plant to grow: the embryo, the endosperm, or cotyledon that provides its first food, the seed coat that protects it, and a set of biochemical preparations for dormancy. A state of suspended animation so deep and so effective that even the most ordinary seeds from a garden shelf can remain viable for years or decades. The seed's metabolism does not stop during dormancy. It merely slows to a pace so glacial that its energy stores are consumed at rates that make years seem trivial, decades manageable, and, under sufficiently cold and stable conditions, millennia possible. The lotus seed is perhaps the most celebrated example in warmer climates. Seeds of the sacred lotus, recovered from an ancient dry lakebed in Manchuria in the 1990s, germinated successfully after being dated to approximately 1,200 years of age. This longevity is thought to result from the particular chemistry of the lotus seed coat, which is extraordinarily impermeable to water and contains repair enzymes that spend their slow centuries fixing the molecular damage that accumulates even in dormancy, mending the breaks in DNA, correcting the oxidative damage that time and background radiation inevitably produce, maintaining the integrity of the cellular machinery through patient, quiet, continuous work. The seed knows, in whatever way a seed can be said to know anything, that now is not the time. That the conditions for growth have not arrived. That the warmth, the moisture, the light, the chemical signals from the soil that indicate a moment favorable to life, these things have not yet come together in the right combination, and so it waits, quietly, without urgency, without distress, simply present, simply whole, carrying within its small shell the entire blueprint for a living thing, holding it in trust for the moment when the world is ready to receive it. There is something here that the mind returns to, if you let it. The patience of seeds is unlike anything in our ordinary experience of time. It is a patience without anxiety, without the awareness of time passing, without the restlessness that waiting produces in creatures with minds. The seed does not wait impatiently. The seed simply is, in its dormancy, what it was meant to be. Potential held in stillness, life compressed to its most essential, most enduring form, ready, but not yet ready to begin. And when the moment comes, when the warmth and the moisture and the light and the soil chemistry all converge, the seed does not hesitate. The coat splits. The root emerges, reaching downward with an urgency that has been accumulating quietly for 100 or 1,000 or 32,000 years. The first leaf unfolds, impossibly green, impossibly soft, into whatever world has finally arrived to receive it. The seed had all the time in the world, and it used it well. In the autumn, from across the vast breadth of North America, from the forests of southern Canada, from the meadows of the American Midwest, from gardens and roadsides and wildflower fields, from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, a migration begins. Not of birds, not of mammals, not of anything warm-blooded or large enough to be easily seen against the sky. Millions of monarch butterflies, each one weighing less than half a gram, begin to move south and west, following routes they have never traveled, navigating toward a destination they have never seen, to spend the winter in Oyamel fir forests in the mountains of central Mexico that their great-great-grandparents left the previous spring. The mathematics of this migration are, when examined closely, almost too improbable to accept. The monarchs that migrate in any given year are not the same individuals that arrived from Mexico the previous spring. The monarch butterfly completes several generations in the course of a summer, Each one a different, shorter-lived generation that breeds and dies in a matter of weeks. And it is only the final generation of autumn, emerging from their chrysalises in late summer, that carries within them the biological imperative to migrate rather than breed. This generation, called the Methuselah generation, because it lives for 8 or 9 months rather than the usual few weeks, does not mate when it emerges. It feeds intensively to build up fat reserves, and then it flies. It flies south and west, guided by the angle of sunlight in a way that requires the butterfly to integrate both the position of the sun in the sky and the time of day, using an internal circadian clock calibrated in the antennae to compensate for the sun's movement. It follows the Earth's magnetic field. It may follow topographic features, mountain ridges, river valleys, coastlines that funnel the migration toward its destination. And somehow, across the hundreds of generations that separate one overwintering from the next, the information about where to go and how to get there is preserved. Not in memory, not in language, not in any form of cultural transmission. It is preserved in the butterfly's body, in its nervous system, in its biochemistry, in the genes that encode the sensitivity to photoperiod that triggers the diapause of migration, in the inherited response to magnetic and solar cues. The destination, those specific mountains in Mexico, that specific altitude range and microclimate where the forest temperature stays just above freezing, where the butterflies cluster by the millions on the trunks and branches of fir trees like living leaves, their folded orange and black wings creating a covering so dense it bows the branches. All of this is somehow encoded in the DNA of an animal with a brain the size of a grain of rice. When the monarchs arrive at their overwintering sites, they hang in the trees in a state of torpor, barely moving, barely eating, barely alive by the standards of their summer selves. The forest is cold enough to slow their metabolism to a fraction of its active rate, but not so cold that they freeze. The microclimate of these particular mountains, shaped by their specific altitude and their orientation relative to the prevailing weather patterns of central Mexico, creates a kind of biological refrigerator, preserving the butterflies through the winter months until the lengthening days of late January and February trigger a change in their biochemistry, and they rouse themselves, mate, and begin to move north again. Each individual monarch makes only a fraction of the total round trip. The generation that overwinters in Mexico will fly north in spring as far as Texas, where they lay eggs on milkweed plants and die. Their offspring will continue north. Their offspring's offspring will go further still. It takes 3 or 4 generations to repopulate the northern range, and then the cycle begins again. Somehow, the information about where to go persists across all of this. The butterfly that emerged from a chrysalis in a Minnesota garden in September carries within it a set of navigational instructions assembled from the experiences of ancestors it never met, encoded in a biological substrate that has been refined by millions of years of selection for successful migration. The delicacy of it takes the breath away, something that weighs less than a paperclip, navigating by the sun and the magnetic field of the Earth, crossing the Gulf of Mexico in a single flight in some years, finding its way to a cluster of mountains it has never seen. Trusting in whatever wordless way a butterfly can trust the instructions written into it by time. There are places in the world so quiet that the sound of your own heartbeat becomes audible. This is not a comfortable experience for everyone. The anechoic chamber, a room designed to absorb as close to 100% of sound as is technically achievable, lined with foam wedges that trap even the subtlest acoustic reflections, produces a quiet sounds the body makes, the pulse, the sounds the body makes, the pulse, the rush of blood in the ears, the subtle creak of joints. become impossible to ignore, and the mind, finding nothing external to attend to, turns inward with an intensity that most people find disturbing rather than peaceful. True silence, then, is not what we mean when we speak of quiet as something restful. The quiet we seek is not the absence of sound, but the presence of the right sounds. Soft, non-threatening, rhythmic, and rich enough to provide the gentle engagement that allows the foreground noise of anxious, effortful thought to recede. Natural quiet is different from anechoic silence in this exact way. A forest on a still day is not silent. It is full of soft, low-level sound, the distant call of birds, the faint movement of branches, the occasional sound of a small animal in the undergrowth, the white noise of leaves. What makes it feel quiet is not the absence of sound, but the absence of sharp, alarming, attention-demanding sound. The sounds present in a natural environment tend to be gradual in their onset, relatively predictable in their pattern, and absent of the urgent semantic content of words, of notifications, of the requests and demands that populate the human-made acoustic environment. In the absence of semantic content, in a place where the sounds around you carry no messages you need to decode, no information requiring a response, a particular kind of cognitive rest becomes possible. The language centers of the brain, which are almost constantly engaged in waking life, can ease their activity. The prefrontal cortex, associated with planning, problem-solving, and the maintenance of the vigilant attention that modern life requires, can reduce its load. And as those systems quiet, others emerge. Older, deeper systems, associated with body awareness, with the processing of sensory experience without evaluation, with a mode of being present that is more like perception than thinking. This state, documented in research on attention restoration theory and on the neurological effects of natural environments, is associated with measurable improvements in mood, in creativity, in the ability to return to focused tasks with renewed attention afterward. The brain needs rest in the way the body needs rest. Not the absence of all activity, but a shift from one kind of activity to another, from the demanding, evaluative, language-saturated processing of ordinary life to the quieter, more receptive mode that the natural world tends to support. Deep quiet teaches something else too, if you sit in it long enough. It teaches you what is underneath your ordinary experience, what is present when the surface noise clears away. And what most people find there, when the conditions are right, is not emptiness. It is something that, for lack of a better word, might be called presence. A simple, basic awareness of existing, of breathing, of being one warm and temporary body somewhere in a large and quietly extraordinary world. That awareness doesn't need to be cultivated or practiced or improved. It is there already in all of us, waiting beneath the noise. The quiet only reveals it. Water remembers the shape of the land. Not literally, of course. Water has no memory in the neurological sense. But the path of a river is the accumulated record of every force that has acted on the landscape since the water began to flow. The slope of the terrain, the hardness of the rock, the fractures and faults in the earth, the accumulation of sediment over thousands of years, the occasional catastrophic flood that scours out a new channel and then retreats, leaving the river slightly altered in its course. A mature river in a flat landscape, freed from the constraint of hard rock, will naturally develop a meandering form, a series of sweeping curves and bends that grow more pronounced over time as the natural physics of moving water erode the outer banks of each curve and deposit sediment on the inner ones. The river does not meander because it is lazy or inefficient. It meanders because meandering distributes the energy of the flowing water in a way that minimizes the work the river has to do over the long run, approaching a form of dynamic equilibrium between the forces acting on it. The meander is, in this sense, the most natural and least effortful path available to moving water. Over very long timescales, river meanders can wander across enormous areas. The whole width of a floodplain over hundreds of thousands of years as the river migrates back and forth across the flat terrain, leaving behind oxbow lakes where old meander loops have been cut off, and swamp and wetland and rich alluvial soil wherever it has previously flowed. The Mississippi River, in its lower reaches, has meandered across a floodplain hundreds of kilometers wide over the last 10,000 years, each major flood shifting the main channel slightly, each period of stability allowing the meander loops to grow. The sound of a river is, like rain and the sea, a form of broadband acoustic comfort. But a river has a different quality of sound from ocean waves, more variable, more intimate, more closely tied to the particular geography it flows through. A river over limestone sounds different from a river over granite. A river in a narrow canyon sounds different from a river on a wide gravel plain. Each river has its own voice, built from the specific combination of water volume, gradient, and substrate that it passes through. And that voice changes as you move along it, quicker and higher in the riffles, lower and more rolling in the deeper pools, hushed where the water is deep and slow and the banks are close together. There is an ancient human relationship with rivers that shapes our response to their sound in the same way that our evolutionary history in forests shapes our response to fight on sides. Rivers were, for most of human history, the roads, the boundaries, the sources of food and water, and the materials of daily life. The particular quality of attention that a river demands, a soft watchfulness, alert to the movement of fish and birds and the changing condition of the water, but not the sharp, urgent alertness required by danger, is the kind of attention that has been quietly useful for a very long time. And the brain, in the presence of moving water, tends to shift toward it. A river also embodies something that is harder to name than any of these practical considerations. It embodies continuity. The water that passes any given point on a river is always different water. The specific molecules that constitute a river in this moment will be somewhere else in an hour, somewhere else entirely in a day. And yet, the river is recognizably the same river, flowing in the same bed, making the same sounds, expressing the same personality that it has expressed for as long as it has flowed. The river is both always different and always itself. It is a beautiful model of something we find difficult to hold in the mind, that things can change continuously and remain continuously what they are. The river flows. It does not arrive. It does not begin or end, not in any place you can stand and observe. It simply moves, always moving, always the same river, always carrying different water, always on its way from somewhere to somewhere else. There is a peace in watching that, a peace that asks nothing except the willingness to notice what is already there, already happening, already perfectly itself. In the spring, when the days begin to lengthen in the northern latitudes and the air carries the first warmth of a season, still weeks away from fully arriving, something stirs in the body of a bird. It is not a thought, not a decision in any sense we would recognize. It is a physiological cascade, a change in the bird's hormonal state triggered by the altered photoperiod, the lengthening of daylight as the Earth tilts on its axis, and the northern hemisphere begins its long turn back toward the sun. Gonads enlarge. Fat reserves are rapidly accumulated. Migratory restlessness, a behavior called Zugunruhe in the German ornithological tradition, increases at night, as the bird shows a preference for orienting itself in the direction of migration even in the absence of any external cue. The body is preparing to move. And then, on a night when the conditions are right, clear sky, favorable winds, a barometric pressure that the bird's physiology reads as promising, it goes. The migratory navigational capacity of birds is one of the most studied and still one of the most incompletely understood phenomena in biology. What we know is that birds use not one, but several independent navigational systems simultaneously, cross-checking them against one another in ways that produce a redundancy and a reliability that our own best navigation technology cannot quite match in terms of the elegance of the solution. Stars are one map. Many migratory birds are capable of stellar navigation, not by following specific star patterns, but by detecting the rotational axis of the night sky. Young birds, during a sensitive period before their first migration, learn the night sky and identify the area of least movement, the celestial pole, and encode this as north. On subsequent migrations, they can orient by any visible portion of the night sky, recalculating the pole's position from whatever stars are visible through whatever gaps exist in the clouds. The Earth's magnetic field is another. Birds have been found to contain cryptochromes, light-sensitive proteins in the eye, that appear to function as a form of magnetic compass, giving the bird information about the inclination of the magnetic field relative to the direction of gravity, which varies in a predictable way between the equatorial regions and the poles. This does not give the bird a position fix. It does not function like GPS, but it provides a consistent directional reference that the bird can use to maintain a heading even when stars and landmarks are unavailable. Landmarks, coastlines, river valleys, mountain ridges, the shapes of cities seen from above, are used by experienced birds who have made the journey before. Young birds making their first migration often navigate less precisely than older individuals, demonstrating that experience refines the map. Smell, sound, and even the infrasound produced by ocean waves breaking on distant coastlines may provide additional navigational information in some species. The Arctic tern makes the longest migration of any known animal, from its Arctic breeding grounds to its Antarctic wintering grounds and back, a round trip of approximately 71,000 kilometers each year. Over the course of its approximately 30-year lifespan, a single Arctic tern will travel the equivalent of 3 round trips to the moon. It navigates this journey, this extraordinary odyssey to the far ends of the planet and back, using systems assembled by evolution over millions of years, encoded in biology rather than technology, requiring no infrastructure, no power source, no maintenance. A bird flying at night over an ocean it cannot see the bottom of, navigating by the position of stars filtered through partly cloudy skies. Reading the inclination of an invisible magnetic field, knowing in whatever way a bird knows where it is going, There is in that image a particular kind of quiet competence, a quiet belonging to the world that is both humbling and deeply beautiful. The bird is not lost. It has never been lost. It carries its map within it. A glacier is a river of ice, but the comparison only begins to capture what a glacier is. Where a river moves in hours and days, a glacier moves in years and centuries. Where a river responds to rainfall within hours, a glacier carries within its ice the accumulated snowfall of hundreds or thousands of years, compressing and recrystallizing and flowing downslope so slowly that the movement is invisible to any observation shorter than months. And yet, move it does. The ice at the base, under the enormous pressure of the mass above, behaves not as a rigid solid, but as an extremely viscous fluid, deforming and flowing in response to the stress imposed upon it, carrying everything caught within it, dust and boulders and the remains of long extinct creatures, slowly toward the valley floor. The ice in a glacier is not simply frozen water. It is a geological record. Each winter's snowfall adds a new layer, a stratum with its own chemical signature, its own content of trapped air bubbles that preserve the composition of the atmosphere. At the time, the snow fell. The deepest ice in the world's ice sheets. The great ice masses of Antarctica and Greenland, which are not technically glaciers but ice sheets of extraordinary scale, contains air that was last in contact with the atmosphere 800,000 years ago. By drilling down through these ice sheets and extracting cores, scientists can read the history of Earth's climate back to a time when our species did not yet exist. The air bubbles in ancient ice preserve the concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane as they were when the snow fell and was compressed into glacial ice. They preserve volcanic ash from eruptions that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, ash that settled on the ice surface and was covered by subsequent snowfall and buried, waiting centuries to be extracted and identified. They preserve microorganisms, pollen grains, dust particles that have traveled from distant continents on the wind, a biological and geochemical archive of extraordinary completeness, read out, layer by layer, by scientists drilling through ice in conditions of extreme cold and extraordinary logistics. The ice is also, in some sense, alive with physics. At the grounding line of a marine glacier, the point where the glacier meets the sea, meltwater and ocean water interact in ways that drive circulation patterns affecting the entire ocean. The carving of icebergs, the fracture and release of enormous masses of ice into the ocean, produces sounds audible from miles away. Deep booms, prolonged groans, the explosive crack of tons of ice meeting water. The surface of an active glacier is constantly shifting, and the crevasses that open as different parts of the glacier move at different speeds are features of extraordinary beauty. Blue-walled chasms dropping into dark, shaded depths, the ice stratified in colors ranging from white at the surface to the deepest, most saturated blue in the compressed layers below. The color of glacial ice is a blue that has no exact equivalent in any other material in the natural world. It occurs because ice absorbs the red end of the visible spectrum preferentially and scatters the blue. And in the compressed, bubble-free ice of deep glacier layers, this effect is profound. Standing inside a glacial ice cave, the light that reaches you has passed through meters of ice and arrived stripped of its warmth. All red and orange and yellow filtered out, leaving something cool and pure, and unlike anything else. It is the blue of a thing that has been slowly made by time, that has been pressed and refined and purified over centuries of accumulation. A glacier is not fast. It is not urgent. It does not hurry. It carries its age visibly in its layers, does its work through the simple application of enormous mass over enormous time, and it remembers, in its ice, everything that fell on it while it was being built. There is something about that patience, that quiet accumulation, that makes a glacier feel less like a physical object and more like a way of being in the world. Patient, heavy with memory, moving always in the direction the weight of time dictates. At the margins of the sea, where the rock meets the water and neither fully claims the territory, there are places that exist at the edge of two worlds and fully belong to neither. Tidal pools form wherever the rocky coastline is shaped in such a way that retreating tides leave pockets and basins of seawater behind. The ocean drains away, taking most of its inhabitants with it. But in the crevices and hollows of the intertidal rock, small worlds remain. Enclosed, concentrated, teeming. And what those small worlds contain in the few square meters of rock and water they occupy rivals in its diversity and its intricacy almost anything else of comparable size on Earth. The intertidal zone is one of the most stressful environments in biology. In the space of a few hours twice each day, the conditions in a tidal pool shift from submersion in cool, oxygenated seawater to exposure to full sunlight and air, with temperatures that can rise dramatically as the water heats in the contained pool. Salinity, that may increase as evaporation concentrates the salt, and oxygen levels that can either rise from photosynthesis or drop from respiration depending on the balance of organisms present. Only animals and plants specifically adapted to these rapid and dramatic fluctuations can survive here. And yet the pool is full. Sea anemones expand their tentacles in the water, contracting into tight glassy spheres when the air arrives. Hermit crabs pick their way across the pool floor, their borrowed shells clicking against rock. Sea urchins find crevices and wedge themselves in with their spines. Limpets, those flattened conical mollusks so characteristic of rocky shores, grip the rock surface with a muscular foot that can exert a holding force proportionally greater than any mechanical fastener, of comparable size, returning, when the tide goes out, to the exact spot they left, where they have been slowly grinding the rock surface into a shape perfectly matching their own shell edge. In the pools, small fish hover in the middle water, maintaining position with tiny adjustments of their fins. Sculpin and blennies stare from under ledges with eyes positioned on the tops of their heads. An adaptation for a life lived at the surface of things, watching upward and outward simultaneously. Sea stars move impossibly slowly across the rock face, their hundreds of tiny tube feet operating by hydraulic pressure, each one extending and contracting in sequence to produce a movement that looks, from a distance, like flowing. The biodiversity of a tidal pool is not just a list of species, it is a set of relationships. The sea star is a keystone predator whose presence or absence determines the entire structure of the community around it. When ecologist Robert Payne removed sea stars from a stretch of intertidal coast in Washington state in the 1960s, the result was dramatic. Mussel populations exploded without their main predator, crowding out the other species and reducing the total diversity of the area dramatically. When sea stars were present, they kept the mussels in check, and the space freed up by their predation allowed dozens of other species to coexist. The sea star was not merely a member of the community, it was the condition that made the community possible. A tidal pool is a place to sit and look, really look, at the complexity that has developed in a small, cold, difficult place, and to be reminded that complexity is not the product of abundance. It is the product of relationship. Every organism in the pool is what it is partly because of every other organism present. The interactions, predation, competition, mutualism, facilitation, create through their ongoing negotiation something more intricate and more stable than any single organism could maintain alone. To look into a tidal pool for long enough is to see a version of every ecosystem compressed into a few square meters of rock and held water. Everything necessary is there. The plants that capture sunlight, the grazers that eat them, the predators that eat the grazers, the detritivores that process what is left. The whole cycle of energy and matter, turning in a small, cold, luminous space at the edge of the sea. In the darkness of a beehive, on the surface of a vertical comb of wax, a honeybee is dancing. The dance is not random, it is a language a system of symbolic communication so precise and so sophisticated that Carl von Frisch, the Austrian ethologist who spent decades decoding it, received the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine in 1973 for his work. The dance communicates to bees attending the dancer in the dark, not merely that food exists, but where it is. Direction, distance, and quality, all encoded in the movements of a bee's body, all interpretable by other bees who will use this information to fly, with extraordinary accuracy, to flowers they have never visited and may be several kilometers away. The round dance is used when food is close, within roughly 100 meters of the hive. The dancing bee moves in small circles, alternating left and right, and the vigor of the dance communicates something about the quality of the food found. Bees attending the dancer make contact with it through touch and vibration, and within minutes, some will leave the hive and search the immediate area for the source. When food is further away, the dance changes. The waggle dance, named for the waggling movement of the abdomen, encodes both direction and distance. The bee runs in a straight line while waggling its abdomen, then circles back to the starting point, alternating the direction of the return loop. The angle of the straight run relative to vertical corresponds to the angle of the food source relative to the sun. If the bee runs straight up the comb, the food is in the direction of the sun. If the run is angled 45 degrees to the left of vertical, the food is 45 degrees to the left of the sun's current position. The duration of the waggle run encodes distance. A longer run means a more distant food source, in a relationship that has been calibrated with extraordinary precision by von Frisch and subsequent researchers. And the sun moves as the day progresses. A bee that has danced its direction in the morning and whose dance is attended by bees in the afternoon must communicate the updated direction relative to a sun that has moved. Research has found that bees do, in fact, update their dances for solar movement. They appear to maintain an internal model of the sun's arc across the sky, compensating for its movement even inside the dark hive, where the sun cannot be directly observed. This internal sun clock is recalibrated on each foraging trip, and it allows the directions encoded in the dance to remain accurate across the course of a day. What makes all of this so remarkable is not merely its precision, but its abstractness. The dance is not an imitation of the flight to the food source. It is a symbolic representation, a set of arbitrary physical movements that, by convention shared within the species, stand for something entirely different from the movements themselves. An angle on a vertical surface represents a compass bearing. A duration represents a distance. The correspondence between the symbol and what it represents is not intuitive. It must be learned, or more precisely, it is inherited as a capacity that is then sharpened by experience. Bees that grow up in isolation and have never attended a dance cannot interpret one correctly the first time they try. Experience in the hive, observation of dances, and the feedback of following dance information to its destination all contribute to the development of the full communicative competence. A hive of bees is, in this sense, a kind of distributed mind. Not a single intelligence, but a collective intelligence made of 50,000 or more individuals, each one contributing its information and its labor to a whole that is far more complex and more capable than any individual could be. The hive does not have a central decision maker. The queen's role is reproduction, not governance. Decisions about where to forage, where to build, when to swarm, are made by a process that resembles, with striking fidelity, the process of deliberation in a human democratic assembly. Scouts investigate options, report back through dance. Other bees are recruited or not based on the quality of the reports. and eventually a consensus emerges from the accumulated weight of evidence communicated through the movements of small, furry bodies in the dark. All of this happening in a hive hanging from a branch in an apple tree in a meadow somewhere on a summer afternoon, while you walk past and hear nothing but the soft, collective, deeply peaceful hum of 50,000 bees going about their work. The hum itself is a form of communication. The frequency of a bee's wing beat conveys information to flowers, causing them to release pollen in a process called buzz pollination. The bees are talking to the flowers, and the flowers are answering, and the whole sweet interaction has been going on for millions of years in the meadows and forests of the world, building the fruits and seeds and plant diversity that feed almost everything. Listen sometime to the hum of a hive. It is one of the world's oldest and most productive conversations, carried on in a language we are only beginning to understand. We have traveled a long way together, and in a sense we have not moved at all. We began in a forest, standing at the surface of a conversation that has been ongoing for 500 million years. The conversation between trees and the fungal networks that hold them together, the quiet exchange of sugar and mineral that binds the forest into something more than a collection of individual plants. We learned that the forest, in its chemistry, already knows how to help us rest, that the rain, in its physics, already knows how to soften the mind, that the ocean, in its bioluminescent dark, already knows how to make light where there seems to be only darkness. We followed a whale across an ocean and found, in its navigation, a reminder of how many ways there are to know where you are. We looked up at mountains and found them, against all expectation, still growing, slowly, patiently, 5 millimeters at a time. We traced a wave from its birth in a storm to its death on a shore, and found that what traveled was not water but energy, not matter, but pattern. We sat with an octopus in a rocky crevice and allowed ourselves to be surprised by the shapes that intelligence can take. We looked at a coral reef and saw what can now be built over thousands of years by creatures with no brains and no plans, simply living and dying and leaving something behind. We followed sunlight from its birth in nuclear fire to its landing on a face on a spring afternoon, and found in that 8-minute journey the shadow of a story 100,000 years long. We lay down on moss and felt the world go quiet. We breathed with the planet through its seasons. We found mathematics in a flower and recognized in the spiral of a shell the universe's preference for elegance. We looked up at the night sky and found it full of the past, the light of stars that may no longer exist, arriving at our eyes after journeys of hundreds and thousands and millions of years, carrying within it the history of a universe far older and stranger than our daily experience suggests. We sat by a fire and felt something very old and very quiet in us lean toward the warmth. We considered a seed, patient in the dark of the earth, carrying everything it needs for a life it has not yet begun. We watched monarch butterflies navigate by the sun across a continent they have never seen, carrying within them instructions assembled by ancestors dead for 100 generations. We sat in natural quiet and found what is underneath the noise, not emptiness but presence. We followed a river and found, in its continuous movement, a model of what it means to be always changing and always oneself. We watched birds navigate by starlight across dark oceans. We stood at the face of a glacier and felt, in its cold blue depths, the memory of 800,000 winters. We peered into the small, luminous world of a tidal pool and found every ecological principle compressed into a space you could step across in 3 paces. We listened to a beehive and heard a language older than our own, transacting the business of a world that will always depend on flowers and the creatures that love them. All of this is happening right now. In the forests outside every city, in the soil beneath every field, in the dark water of every ocean, in the soil where seeds lie dormant and the sky where starlight is always arriving. The world is not a backdrop. It is not a setting for the things that we consider important. It is itself the most important thing, this extraordinary, patient, intricate, endlessly surprising living planet, this thin blue margin of water and air and biology wrapped around a ball of cooling rock. This singular expression of what the universe can do when the conditions are right and enough time is given. We have been given time here together to remember this, to step back from the pace of everything and notice that the natural world has always been doing what it does, slowly, thoroughly, without urgency, and that we are part of it, not visitors to it. The iron in your blood was made in a star. The water in your cells has been rain and river and ice and cloud and rain again, cycling through the planet's surface for 4 billion years. The carbon in your body has been photosynthesized, eaten, breathed out, dissolved, lithified, subducted, and returned to the surface through volcanic activity more times than any calculation has yet attempted. You are, in the most literal sense, ancient. You are made of the world's oldest materials, arranged by 4 billion years of biological experimentation into a form capable of noticing that it is ancient, capable of looking at stars and understanding their light, capable of sitting in a forest and feeling the chemistry of calm, capable of this particular and extraordinary thing, quiet wonder. That wonder does not need to be loud or urgent or performed. It can be, and perhaps most truly is, exactly what it feels like right now. Something soft and still, a small warmth in the chest, a sense of the world being larger and more intricate and more beautiful than any single life can fully take in, and that being not a source of anxiety, but of relief, that there is always more, that there is always something happening in some quiet corner of the world that has never been seen, and that, when it is finally seen, will turn out to be extraordinary. The trees are talking right now. The waves are completing their journeys. The monarch butterflies are somewhere navigating by a sun they cannot see, guided by a magnetic field they cannot name, on their way to mountains they have never visited but somehow know are home. The moss is absorbing sound. The seeds are waiting in the dark. The bees are dancing in their darkness, telling each other where the flowers are. The glacier is moving, one slow century at a time, toward the sea. The light is on its way. Thank you for spending this time with quiet knowledge. Thank you for settling in, for slowing down, for following the quiet things into the quiet places they inhabit. It means something to us that you are here, that in the middle of everything that fills a life, you found a moment to sit with the natural world and listen to what it has been saying, patiently, for a very long time. If you leave this space a little more rested than when you arrived, a little more aware of the deep intelligence that moves through the world beneath and around everything we do, then we have done exactly what we hoped to do. The forest is still there, the ocean is still breathing, the stars are still sending their ancient light, and somewhere, 8 minutes away, the sun is still burning, and the light is still on its way. Rest well. The world will be here when you wake.